Last week, I spoke with Professor Merendi, who's advising the Iranian delegation. This week, I sat down with Dr. Bagheri, Iran's chief negotiator. He's tasked with representing Iran at these talks and forging the best possible outcome for Iran's interests. That means getting the United States to respect the deal they signed together in 2015 and to lift all sanctions. I asked him how the talks were progressing, about Iran's recent draft proposals, threats and intimidation by Israel, and whether Iran could trust the Americans not to break the deal again if they actually go back in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching The Communique. Dr. Bagheri, first of all, welcome to Vienna, and thank you for taking the time to sit down and do this interview with me and Press TV. The first question I wanted to ask you is, you have now resumed the seventh round of nuclear negotiations, talks to get sanctions lifted. This is the first time you're leading this delegation under the new Raisi government. What are you doing differently compared to your predecessors who were here 5 months ago?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. اون چیزی که ما روش تأکید داریم در این گفتگو
What we are emphasizing in this round of negotiations and what has been already emphasized by the President of the Islamic Republic of Iran and other senior officials is that in the Vienna talks, our main priority is to remove the illegal and cruel sanctions which have been imposed and reinstated against the Iranian nation during the past several years. The sanctions imposed and reimposed by the United States against the Iranian nation are in violation of the international law and regulations as well as principles and an international agreement called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as well as the provisions of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231. In addition to Iran, other members of the Group 4+1 and even the new U.S. administration, they all agree and confess that the previous administration of the United States did a wrongdoing in pulling out of the JCPOA, and for this reason, the new administration, the Biden administration, wants to return from that mistake, and they want to return to the 2015 agreement.
And speaking of these unilateral sanctions that have been imposed by the United States, you've submitted two draft proposals just last week, one on sanctions removal and the other one on Iran's nuclear commitments. Has there been any progress with these draft proposals, and when can we expect to see a third? What would be in the third?
During 6 rounds of negotiations in Vienna in the past, ultimately the two sides drafted some text, several texts. 2 of them were about the removal of sanctions and Iran's nuclear commitment. There was presidential elections in Iran, there was a new government in power, there was a new approach, new priorities in various areas, including the foreign policy, and it was normal that the new government, the new administration, would have some observations and modifications with regard to the text drafted on the 20th of June this year. And on the basis of this, the Iranian side incorporated its observations and modifications on the sanctions removal and on the nuclear commitments into the draft documents concluded in 20th of June 2021. In one of the drafts of the 20th of June, which was on the nuclear commitments of Iran, there were numerous differences between the two parties. And the draft text of nuclear commitments included and contained a lot of brackets which indicated differences in approach between the two parties. The modifications formulated by the new Iranian team on the text on nuclear commitments were much less than the differences and issues of differences which existed in the original 20th of June document. And since the beginning of the new negotiations, as of 29th of November, various sessions and working groups were held at the experts level and senior political directors level in order to discuss both the drafts. And during the past days, there have been a lot of sessions of the Working Group on Nuclear Commitments in order to identify the differences in the draft text on nuclear commitments within the framework, within a specific framework, and in order to restrict and limit the number of differences. And on such a basis, there is still ongoing negotiations between the two sides in order to finalize the issue of differences between the two sides so that we enter into negotiations to remove those differences. And very good progress have been made as with the meetings which had been taking place since several days ago.
In terms of what was drafted in June and what's being drafted now, there are American officials, anonymous officials talking to the press who say that Iran has basically pocketed all the beneficial concessions, the things that are good for Iran, and dropped all the other things, and that Iran is buying time, trying to waste time with the negotiations. I mean, this doesn't reflect what you just told me, where there's progress being made. Where do these opinions come from? What are they based on in the Western press?
We are presently facing two atmospheres, two places. One atmosphere or space is inside the negotiating room, and one is outside. Inside the negotiating room, there are specific parties that are negotiating, and they are already clear. But outside the negotiating room, it is not clear which identities are operating and what are they doing. The same escalatory identities that targeted Iran's nuclear facilities in terrorist operations and terrorist attacks, the same escalatory identities are trying to seriously provide obstacles and create obstacles on the progress of nuclear negotiation. And in addition of trying to poison the atmosphere outside the negotiating room, they are hoping that they would be able to provide a disconstructive or non-constructive atmosphere also inside the room.
Speaking of these provocateurs, people who are trying to escalate the situation, Israel in the last years, they've killed Iranian nuclear scientists. They've committed acts of cyber attacks, acts of nuclear terrorism, sabotage in nuclear facilities. How is that factored into the talks? Does this even come up during the talks? Because the United States has participated with Israel on these attacks. And what's your reaction to these statements coming out in the last days that Israel is basically preparing a plan B or some kind of backup plan, which would include military action in case the talks in Vienna don't work out?
It is already crystal clear that Zionists are trying very seriously in order to have a negative, a non-constructive and destructive atmosphere inside the negotiating room. They are pursuing the same destructive measures, as I mentioned, outside the negotiating room. And for this reason, the Zionist regime authorities are trying to spread the role of such a destructive role to the players which may have an influence inside the negotiating room. And some of these players are having some sort of contradictory behavior. On one hand, they are saying that we are negotiating in order to resurrect the deal and the United States returns to the deal. And on the other hand, they are either authoring and writing joint press opinions and articles and participate in long-hour meetings with that illegitimate entity in order to destroy the negotiations or create serious obstacles on the way of progress of negotiations. And any impediment or obstacle on the way of the progress of negotiations should be blamed on the players which provide the Zionist regime with the chance, with the opportunity, with the capacity and possibility to conduct destructive and non-constructive measures on the progress of negotiations.
Dr. Bagheri, you mentioned this kind of contradictory behavior. Something that stands out is in the last week, the United States has imposed more sanctions on Iran, while there are talks ongoing to lift sanctions on Iran. The Biden administration said it would rejoin the JCPOA. Biden's been president for almost a year. That's still not happened. And he's kept the maximum pressure campaign that Trump put in place. Again, how do you reconcile these contradictory positions coming from the Americans?
We also believe that this is a contradictory and double-sided behavior by the U.S. government, and we believe that this is the U.S. administration which should explain about such contradictions in their behavior.
The follow-up that I wanted to ask you is that in terms of sanctions removal, the United States, they have various labels, right? So now they have nuclear-related sanctions, non-nuclear-related sanctions. Is their position still that they're only going to lift the nuclear-related sanctions and everything else stays?
Still on the issue of sanctions and removal of sanctions, the process of serious and real negotiations have not yet started. Of course, several drafts have been exchanged between the two sides. But what is clear and what is significant is that from our point of view, any sanction which is in contradiction and inconsistent with the JCPOA and the nuclear deal should be removed immediately. Either these sanctions have been imposed during Obama or Trump or Biden administrations. All of them should be removed. The same case applies with all the sanctions which are somehow related to the JCPOA, and they also need to be lifted. And on the same basis, all the sanctions which have been imposed under the so-called maximum pressure campaign by the U.S. administration, they need to be removed because they are related to the JCPOA.
The argument from the West, from the Americans, is that Iran is moving too quickly with its nuclear program. I believe Robert Malley, who's the special envoy of the U.S. to Iran, he said that this is not a chronological problem, it's a technological clock that's in place, that basically Iran needs to slow down its nuclear program. How do you plan on, let's say, for example, tomorrow morning the JCPOA is back in place with the Americans, they return. How would Iran basically scale back its nuclear program and get back to where it was before? And, what is your response to this idea that Iran is breaching the agreement, even though Iran is still in the JCPOA?
All the nuclear activities of Iran are being undertaken within the framework of the NPT and the Safeguards Agreement. And all the nuclear activities of Iran comprehensively are being inspected by the IAEA authorities. Iran does not have any secret nuclear activities. And the nuclear activities Iran is taking at the moment is exactly compatible with the JCPOA, because paragraphs 26 and 36 of the JCPOA entitles Iran in order to wholly or partially suspend its activities if the other party fails to fulfill its commitments. We have announced earlier and we reiterated that our reactions are remedial. And we started our nuclear activities 1 year after the United States pulled out of the nuclear agreement. When the Americans remove the illegal sanctions against Iran, grounds will be paved for Iran to stop its remedial activities.
So, Dr. Bagheri, the JCPOA, it has a mechanism to verify with the IAEA that Iran complies with the agreement, with the accord. What's the mechanism to verify that the Americans will comply with whatever agreement is reached, if it's just returning back to the simple JCPOA? How will Iran be able to verify that the Americans are actually lifting the sanctions? How can you make sure that the next American administration in 2025 is not just going to come in and quit the JCPOA again and put sanctions on Iran again?
There are very differences of opinions and different issues in the draft text provided in the 20th of June. The issues you referred to, the issue of guarantees and the issue of verification, are one of those differences which have not yet been resolved, and they should be resolved in the course of negotiations in order to conclude a mutually agreed deal.
So, just as a last question, what is the biggest obstacle for the JCPOA to be re-implemented in full by everybody?
I believe that if the other party is enjoying a serious determination and practical preparedness in order to fulfill all its obligations within the framework of the JCPOA without any exception, then I truly believe that within a short span of time, we would be able to reach a mutually agreed deal.
Dr. Bagheri, thank you so much for your time and for sitting down with us for this interview. I really appreciate it.
I would also to thank you and your viewers.
Thank you.